Welcome to another Fireside Chat on ABC News and News Radio. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz Licciardello.
Dueling campaign events, a Supreme Court hearing and more worrying polls for Donald Trump. We're into the final stretch and everybody is braced for another October surprise.
Which may or may not be this story about Hunter Biden's emails, although Rudy Giuliani certainly hopes it is.
Later in the show, Republican strategist Mike Madrid from the Lincoln Project will tell us about the states he's watching and whether he thinks that we'll know the result on election night or not.
And constitutional law expert Ilya Shapiro will join us to look at Amy Coney-Barrett's confirmation hearing and the future of the court.
With today's second presidential debate cancelled after President Trump refused to take part in a remote format following his coronavirus diagnosis, he and Joe Biden instead took part in simultaneous but separate town hall events. Trump on NBC, Biden on ABC. But with less than 10% of the audience that would have otherwise tuned into a debate. And there were very contrasting styles. Trump batting away questions from the moderator, Savannah Guthrie, Biden giving long, waffly 10-minute answers to George Stephanopoulos. It started pretty well for President Trump, friendly crowd.
I have to say, you have a great smile.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
He does. You're so handsome when you smile.
But from there, it went downhill fast. After retweeting a conspiracy theory this week about Osama bin Laden and SEAL Team 6, he again refused to denounce the crackpot QAnon conspiracy theory.
I know nothing about QAnon.
I just told you.
I know very little. You told me, but what you tell me doesn't necessarily make it fact. I hate to say that. I know nothing about it. I do know they are very much against pedophilia. They fight it very hard, but I know nothing about it.
They believe it is a satanic cult run by the deep
state.
state.
The subject.
Meanwhile, the focus this week has been on events in swing states and even some usually safe Republican states that polls suggest are looking rather competitive this year. After a week sidelined by COVID-19, the president has been playing defense in Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina and Georgia, all states he won in 2016, but is now trailing in. He's showing extraordinary stamina for somebody less than 2 weeks out of hospital, but he's also showing a certain, shall we say, lack of message discipline, particularly when it comes to the virus.
One thing with me, the nice part, I went through it. Now they say I'm immune. I feel so powerful. I'll walk into that audience. I'll walk in there. I'll kiss everyone in that audience. I'll kiss the guys and the beautiful women and everybody. I'll just give you a big fat kiss.
Yeah, and when you're president, they let you do it. And speaking of weird 2016 flashbacks, this week, a laptop computer, some incriminating emails, and the dark hand of Rudy Giuliani. The Murdoch-owned New York Post this week claimed smoking gun email reveals how Hunter Biden introduced Ukrainian businessman to VP Dad. Former Trump advisor Steve Bannon, who gave the story to the Post, then told the Murdoch-owned Fox Business Channel why he thinks this is such a bombshell story.
The Biden family and Joe Biden has a major national security problem. And that problem is that they've got extensive financial relationships across the globe with, lots of companies controlled by foreign governments, and they've never disclosed it. And Joe Biden has stood on the debate stage across from President Trump. He's lied about it. He's lied about this specific thing with Burisma. He's lied about it consistently, and he's got to be held accountable.
Held accountable for what exactly, though? It's not news that Biden's son Hunter was once on the board of the Ukrainian energy firm Burisma and that firm was investigated for corruption. It is also well known that Joe Biden, as Obama's VP, pressured Ukraine to fire the prosecutor, Viktor Shokin, who had looked into Burisma. Now, in the minds of Steve Bannon, Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani, that closes the loop. Joe Biden corruptly pressured the Ukrainians to sack the prosecutor to protect Burisma and Hunter. Now, so far that has been impossible to prove. Joe Biden says he never spoke to Hunter about Burisma. The prosecutor, he says, was sacked for not investigating corruption. It was the view of the Obama administration, the EU, the International Monetary Fund and others that prosecutor was himself corrupt and not investigating corruption, and nobody has found any evidence that Hunter Biden was a part of any corruption at Burisma anyway. But the New York Post published an email it claims is from Burisma's number 3 executive, Vadim Perezsky, to Hunter Biden, saying, "Dear Hunter, thank you for inviting me to DC and giving an opportunity to meet your father and spent some time together. It's realty and honour and pleasure." So the smoking gun email suggests Hunter arranged a meeting for a Burisma executive to meet with Vice President Joe Biden. And then, less than 8 months later, the VP pressured the Ukrainian president and PM to get rid of Shokin. Now, Rudy says that he got this material from the owner of a computer repair shop who says a laptop computer was dropped off in April last year. He says it had the email plus a video that appears to show Hunter Biden smoking crack while engaged in a sex act with an unidentified woman. Now, the Biden campaign says there never was any meeting between Joe Biden and anyone from Burisma. Facebook and Twitter have taken the rather extraordinary step of blocking any link to the New York Post story. In fact, reporters that just retweeted the story on Wednesday have had their accounts suspended. News outlets are refusing to report on these claims. The concern is, well, that it's simply bunkum, the result of a Russian hack and misinformation campaign. The FBI now has the laptop and is investigating possible links to foreign intelligence agencies. So, very hard to know what to believe in all of this, Chaz, but it's kind of fishy.
Okay, well, let's take it step by step, shall we?
Let's.
First question is, as you say, is the laptop story legit? Okay? Facebook and Twitter are acting as if it's not, as you say, and there are certainly some questions that need to be asked, like, for instance, who exactly dropped this laptop off to the store? The New York Post said the shop owner couldn't positively identify the customer as Hunter Biden. Yet it also says the store owner tried repeatedly to contact the client. And the invoice said it was for Hunter Biden, who, by the way, lived in LA at the time, not Delaware. So why was he dropping off a computer in Delaware? But importantly, what were the contact details that they tried to contact him on? Was it a legit phone number? That would solve some questions, answer some questions. Or if it was by email, where's the evidence that this guy emailed Hunter Biden to get in touch with him? Why was the computer not password protected or encrypted? It was a MacBook. They have passwords. So what's going on there? That seems weird. Why was the invoice for recovery and backup of 3 laptops $85? That's very cheap.
Yeah.
When did Giuliani get this drive, or the copy of the drive, and why did he hold on to it until now? The Daily Beast talked to the shop owner, who appears to be a rabid Trump supporter, and he apparently couldn't get his timeline straight about what point he spoke to the FBI, what point he looked at the laptop, etc. So all those questions go to the credibility. Yeah, well, and this IT guy as well, quite a few things don't add up in his story, including he couldn't necessarily identify Hunter Biden because he says he has a medical condition that means he can't identify people. Now, face blindness is a thing, but that seems convenient. Also convenient, the fact that Rudy Giuliani says Hunter Biden, even though he was heavily intoxicated, probably on crack or something at the time, he signed an extra document which allowed the computer shop owner, that gave the laptops to the computer shop owner, that he would own them if he didn't collect them after 30 days. That's interesting, isn't it? Which I guess is the downside to if you go to such a great value, $85 to fix 3 computers, I guess it's only fair that if you then couldn't be bothered picking them up again, that computer shop owner owns those computers. So there's dodginess around that, for sure. Yeah, I think just look, I'm not committed either way on this. I'm just saying there are a lot of things that are weird about this that I would like to see more investigation of. Let me ask you, does it actually matter if it's hacked, if the information is useful and serious information? Well, I mean, this is the same kind of soul-searching question that the media has had to ask itself repeatedly over the last decade or so, probably starting with the emergence of WikiLeaks. And there is a strong argument that says the media has to be very, very careful about becoming an unwitting or indeed a witting accomplice to foreign election interference. So if in fact it is that these emails were hacked by Russia, and we know that Russia hacked Burisma's computer servers, so if this or some of these emails, that some of the material that they've got, they could have accessed Hunter Biden's computer, is what we're saying, rather than this cover story of the repair shop in Wilmington, which seems
a bit questionable, because he then went on ranting about Seth Rich and all sorts of other stuff as well. So he's a piece of work. But yeah, look, if this were to actually prove that Joe Biden has been lying this whole time, that he was in fact operating after being lobbied by his own son, and he was doing if it proved any of those things, it would be so much in the public interest that it would justify potentially a dubious source.
See, that's my view.
There are lots of dubious sources out there, including people that just, phone reporters in Washington all the time. They're dubious people with, barrows to push. But the problem with this is it doesn't do that. It just doesn't do that. In the same way as Hillary Clinton's emails 4 years ago, there was nothing actually there. Yeah. There was nothing. It was kind of embarrassing or maybe circumstantial, but there was nothing there.
Yeah, I'm going to get to the content in a second, but just going through methodically. The second question is, if the laptop story is ridiculous, forget the laptop story. Is the information accurate? Is it because that's another question. If it's from a dubious source, could they maybe have made a little change here, a little change there? Are the emails verified, etc.? So for my questions for that, well, first of all, we should say there were photos that were there, not just video. There was photos, and we can see some of them there. Oh dear, Hunter. But why were the emails published from a PDF made in August 2019 in the New York Post and not from the actual laptop the New York Post says it has in its possession, or at least the copy of the laptop? Why didn't they put the info from the emails in to authenticate those emails? Because they don't have any info at the top there. Now, we know the FBI took it in December because the New York Post saw a photo of the subpoena, but have the FBI authenticated these emails? We haven't heard anything about this.
No.
They've had the laptop since December. Why did they say nothing during the impeachment, which happened after that? And this was very relevant to the impeachment. So why did the FBI stay mum? Were they just mind their own business? Or did they think there was nothing to it? We don't know. Someone should say something. And I do note, by the way, that when asked about those emails, Hunter Biden's lawyer said this. He's been pushing wildly, he's talking about Giuliani here, he's been pushing widely discredited conspiracy theories about the Biden family, openly relying on actors tied to Russian intelligence. You know what that is? It's not a denial. That's what that is. So what do we think? Is it worth looking at those emails and trying to see if there's any value to them? Or do we just go, no, they're just probably not true?
Well, in the ordinary course of events, you would say, well, it's the job of the FBI to look at these things.
That's right.
And if the FBI thinks that that there's been potentially some inappropriate behaviour by Hunter Biden or by Joe Biden, then they would refer that to the Justice Department. And in ordinary times, we'd be quite relaxed with that process. But of course, given what we've seen in the last 4 years around the FBI and the politicisation of the Justice Department and the way in which, somebody like Rudy Giuliani has still got his claws into the Southern District of New York, it is impossible to see who's going to be an honest broker in all this. And so we're left with, media outlets such as the New York Post with what was a pretty poor piece of journalism in terms of any kind of objective analysis of what they received. This was a very, very credulous piece of reporting, and the way that they were clearly taking part in a hit job on Biden. That's what it amounted to. They weren't the usual journalistic caveats or anything about this. It really, it kind of, and then of course Rudy Giuliani and the indicted Steve Bannon are up to their ears in the whole thing. So it stinks.
In this case, the politicised FBI you refer to have had it for 10 months and said nothing. And the politicisation would suggest they'd be eager to get information out. So the fact they haven't makes me question why they haven't. Okay, but let's go to the last question. If it's all real, if everything's legit and it's all real, is there anything to it? Because I'm not sure there is. Let's look at that email that you just read out before, and I'm going to correct him this time. I'm not going to keep the typos. But this is what he said. He said, "Thank you for inviting me to DC and giving me an opportunity to meet your father and spend some time together." Now, that might mean that they met up. It doesn't have to. That's something you can say after a person has given you the opportunity to organise a meeting before you meet the person.
And because of the confusion in tenses, obviously, we don't know whether that was meant to be written before an alleged meeting or after an alleged meeting, which obviously Biden says didn't happen anyway, and they've shown his schedule.
Yeah.
He didn't conduct that meeting, at least not on the books.
Yeah, well, but let's stipulate to that. Let's just say that they did have the meeting, okay, which not at all demonstrated.
Sure.
But let's say they did.
Go with that.
Then that would at least create a reasonable likelihood that Biden was lying when he said this.
Mr. Vice President, how many times have you ever spoken to your son about his overseas business dealings?
I've never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings.
Okay, so we made lots of generous assumptions there, and so far all we've got is lying to Pete Ducey, right? Okay. The New York Post tries to create some sense of direct connection, as you say, it was a bit of a hit piece, between this email and when Biden had the prosecutor sacked. And they wrote, less than 8 months after however you say his name, Pizarski thanked Hunter Biden for the introduction to his dad, Biden pressured Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko into getting rid of Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin. For 8 months, that's a long time. And Biden was executing long-established American government policy with those actions, so that's hardly a smoking gun. The Post also found an email which suggested Hunter was trying to leverage an upcoming Ukraine visit from Joe Biden to get a contract signed for another $25,000 a month. Now that suggests Hunter was dodgy, right, trying to leverage money. It doesn't implicate Joe Biden though. They also found an email where Pizarski, as you say, he's the third-ranking executive of Burisma. He emailed Hunter asking for, quote, advice on how you could use your influence to convey a message. But is there any evidence that they did actually suggest that they could influence anyone? Because that same email that we're talking about here, these emails show Hunter quite conscious of avoiding inappropriate influence with his father. He wrote in those emails, that Joe Biden's visit should be characterised as part of Hunter's advice and thinking, but, quote, what Joe will say and do is out of our hands. He also wrote, they need to know in no uncertain terms that we will not and cannot intervene directly with domestic policymakers. And he also wrote that if he wasn't asked to earn his keep, then, quote, we will know we are being used in a way that's not appropriate. Now, these are in the smoking gun emails. He's saying, not thinking anyone's going to read it, we need to do this properly. And we can't even tell them that we can influence my dad. So I'm not saying, Hunter Biden does not come out well in this, if this is all true, but I'm not seeing the smoking gun that Rudy Giuliani is saying.
No, but I think Giuliani, even though he is looking for the alleged smoking gun, he's basically pointing to lots of things that look like guns and saying there's smoke coming out of them. There isn't a smoking gun, at least as of yet, but Giuliani knows, as we all know, that there is, at a very superficial level, still this perceived impropriety that Hunter Biden, who we know had substance abuse problems, we know has had a troubled life, and was basically profiting off his family name and his connections to run an investment house, to be doing international business deals, trading, investing, and so on. The very fact that he is close to his father and he shares his father's last name, it wasn't necessarily that there was any expectation that Hunter would be influencing Joe Biden in any way. It was more that we've got Hunter on our board, therefore we get to do a grip and grin at a cocktail party with Joe Biden, and we stick that photo up on the wall of our office, and people coming to see us for a meeting go, oh, you with Joe Biden? Fantastic. That must mean you're in with the Americans. That's probably as far as any of this influence peddling ever goes. It's often conducted in a very superficial way. Other people do it simply by donating $500 at a chicken dinner event to any number of political candidates. It happens all the time in the United States, and there is no smoking gun in terms of policy here. And the fundamental problem is Viktor Shokin was not sacked because he was investigating Burisma. He was sacked because he wasn't investigating Burisma, and a bunch of other things because he was the corruption watchdog who was himself seen by the international community as being corrupt. Not by Joe Biden, not by Hunter Biden, but the international community.
Yeah. Anyway, we should probably move on. I am hoping the FBI comes forward with some answers to some of those questions at least for us to help evaluate. But anyway, before we move on to the polls, I just want to give you a quick lawsuit update. You may recall I told you a few weeks ago about a lawsuit I was expecting in Pennsylvania. Well, look at this clip of Trump spokesperson Hogan Gidley.
What's the actual evidence that they're trying to rig the election?
Nevada is a great example of that. They've now codified into law the acceptance of ballots after Election Day. They send all these ballots out, whether you want one or not, to all of their citizens with prepaid postage. Here's the dirty little secret. Prepaid postage is not date stamped when it goes through the post office, meaning you could wake up on Wednesday morning and say, look, Donald Trump's ahead by 100 votes. I can go find 101 and by law, send them in the mail, get them into the ballot box to be counted by Friday, and it counts. They could literally overturn an election.
Now, what he's saying there sounds insane, but it's possibly true. He is correct that business class mail, where a business can prepay postage, does not automatically get postmarked or date stamped. However, the post office does have a policy of postmarking election mail, but not everyone follows that policy. In the New York primary this year, officials told their local post office counterparts to postmark business class mail, and thousands of ballots were not postmarked. There was a court case about it. Why does this matter? Because several states, Hogan mentioned Nevada, I've been talking about Pennsylvania, have current systems right now where ballots received a few days after the election that have no postmark or other proof of mailing are presumed to have been mailed before Election Day. So, does that mean that Nevada and Pennsylvania's elections are going to be rigged? Not necessarily. People are awake to this. Precautions are being taken. But I'm telling you, John, if it's close, this issue has massive lawsuit written all over it.
All right, so we're going to keep our eyes on that one. Now, here is how the polls are looking. 18 days now out from the election. On the face of it, Donald Trump is in trouble. Joe Biden leads the average of national polls by over 9 points today and the average of battleground state polls by just under 5%. With a Quinnipiac poll out of Georgia this week putting Joe Biden 7 points in front. That tips the average narrowly back into his favour, which means that Biden now has a commanding lead in the Electoral College and would have won easily this week, assuming all those polls are right, of course. But with under 3 weeks to go, here's a slightly concerning fact for Democrats. While Joe Biden is doing 3 points better against Donald Trump in those national polls than Hillary Clinton was at this point 4 years ago, as you noted on Wednesday night, Chaz, on Planet America, in the battleground states, it's a kind of different picture. Donald Trump is actually doing marginally better against Biden than he was against Hillary at this point in 2016, 2.5 weeks out. But there are a few differences, of course. 2016 had a big undecided vote, including those who were parking their votes with the Libertarian and the Green candidates. And of course, at this point, Trump was just through the whole Access Hollywood tape thing, and his numbers had crashed to their lowest point. He was a long way behind at that point, but still, Democrats cannot be spiking the football just yet. Joe Biden, meanwhile, continues to rake in the money, though, and this is an interesting kind of barometer in its own kind of way. He set a new fundraising record for any candidate ever. In the month of September, $383 million in just 30 days. It was a short month. The Biden campaign says they have headed into the final stretch, the final 34 days of this campaign in October into November with $432 million in the bank. And they are spending it on ads like this. A great example of what they call a closing argument ad. Instead of all the negative attacks and everything that dominate the majority of the campaign, candidates usually like to pivot to the positive in the final couple of weeks. Give them an inspiring theme, a reason to get out the vote and seal the deal. Take a look at this.
The days of divisiveness will soon be over.
Yes, a new world's coming.
We can build a more perfect union.
That belongs to you and me.
Let's get back up.
Yes, a new world's coming.
We can't believe it yet.
Now, I think part of what makes that ad particularly effective, as well as Nina Simone, is the ramrod consistency of Joe Biden's message. He's been saying this is a battle for the soul of the nation right back to April last year when he announced that he was running because at the time, of course, you remember he said he decided to run for president because of Donald Trump's mishandling of the racist violence in Charlottesville.
He said there were, quote, some very fine people on both sides. Very fine people on both sides. With those words, the President of the United States assigned a moral equivalence between those spreading hate and those with the courage to stand against it.
Now, at the time, that looked a little bit hokey. You know, nobody really believed a career, presidential wannabe like Joe Biden at the third attempt really only got into this because of was so outraged by Charlottesville. Yet that message has carried Joe Biden for a long time last year looking like the weakest front runner in history, just waiting to be knocked off, to being in a commanding position now to become America's 46th president. A lot can happen in 18 days, of course, but so far nothing, not Tara Reid, not Ukraine, not allegations that he's demented. None of that has changed this trajectory that Joe Biden has been on. And so far, that argument, his version of what this election is about, seems to be right.
Yeah, it's quite ironic that Joe Biden, the guy who's until now most famous for gaffes and for careening off track, has actually run an extraordinarily disciplined campaign.
Yeah.
Like, say what you will about the basement strategy, which I've said plenty, it's disciplined. His message is disciplined.
Yeah.
And Trump is not quite so disciplined, and it's probably helped Biden because of that.
Yeah, Trump is still looking for a way to attack Joe Biden that sticks and a way to argue for a second term that resonates. And that, I guess, is where they are at the moment. Well, joining us now is Mike Madrid. He's a Republican Party strategist, an expert particularly on Latino voting trends, and he's co-founder of this anti-Trump group called the Lincoln Project. Mike Madrid, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat.
Thanks to have you. Thanks for having me back.
We've seen the polls. Joe Biden leading consistently in the average of battleground state polls and leading consistently nationally as well. But what else do you look at, apart from the polls, to get a sense at this point of the race where things are up to?
The main thing we're looking for is what we call the trend line. Each data point of a poll that is released, because there are now so many polls, just becomes basically a pinpoint on a map. And what we're looking for is movement. Is the race continuing to be stratified, staying where it is in its partisan foxholes, or are we starting to see a candidate break out either upward or downward? The good news for Joe Biden is he's breaking out upward, and the bad news for Donald Trump is he's actually moving downward. So we're sitting at historically one of the widest national gaps that we've seen in a very, very long time, probably since at least Bill Clinton's race in 1992, possibly stretching back another 15, 20 years prior to that.
Of course, the national polls paint one picture. The state-based polls that really matter show that it is a significantly tighter race, under 5 points. Are there trend lines there you can discern?
That's a really good question. The main demographic that Donald Trump is going to be relying on to bring this race home for him is going to be non-college educated white men. That is really the bone, the core of Trumpism and Trump's base. It has been remarkably resilient for him for the better part of all 4 years of his administration. But again, some of the bad news is this. In the Rust Belt states, critical states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, those areas are starting to show movement, even with this last demographic, towards Joe Biden. So even that last core constituency that Donald Trump needs to overperform with in key battleground states is starting to show some deterioration in support.
Mike, do you think Latinos are a genuinely reachable demographic for Trump this year?
That's another great question. The short answer is yes. There are small slivers where Donald Trump can actually pick up Hispanic and or Latino votes. Those two areas are with Cuban voters in South Florida, the Miami-Dade area, and increasingly male-born Hispanics under the age of 40 in other southwestern Sunbelt states. The problem is there's really not that many in terms of raw numbers in Florida to actually move the voter model a whole lot. In other words, move the race 2 or 3 percentage points that he really needs. He can probably pick up a point. Maybe if he's really overperforming, gets 2. His bigger problem is he's losing Republican votes of senior citizens in the northern part of the state to a greater degree. And so even if he were able to consolidate that vote, there just aren't the numbers that he's going to need to make this state of Florida specifically more competitive.
Mike, are you going to be focusing particularly on Florida on election night? Because it seems that if Joe Biden can be doing well enough there in the on-the-day voting count, he could have won it on the night.
Yeah, it's basically the issue in Florida is if Joe Biden wins, there's a 98, 99% chance that he will win. It also has the benefit of being what we call an early count state, meaning they begin to process all of their mail ballots starting on October 24th. So we will know very early in the night who is the likely victor in Florida, unless something really remarkable and unfortunate happens. But more to your question, we're actually focused a little bit more on Pennsylvania, and here's why. If Joe Biden wins in Pennsylvania, there's about a 95% chance of him winning. And right now he's sitting at a substantially larger lead in Pennsylvania than he is in Florida. So the movement of those voters, especially some of those non-college educated white voters and African-American turnout, looks very, very robust. Both of those dynamics lead us to believe that Pennsylvania may actually be a better indicator of Joe Biden winning than adding more and more resources into Florida, where it's a little bit more of a toss-up at this point.
I'm glad to hear you say that, Mike. I've been going on about Pennsylvania on this show for the past 2 months, so thank you. But back to Florida for a second. You mentioned the Cubans in Florida. I'm just wondering, someone in your position, when you've got a state like Florida where there are Cuban Hispanics and there's Puerto Ricans and there's Mexicans, and how do you address that wide variety of the same demographic?
That's a really good question, and especially somebody who's been working with the Latino electorate like myself for 30 years. In many ways, this has kind of been the Super Bowl of my career because Florida has by far the most diverse Hispanic electorate. You're absolutely right. 20% of all Floridians are of Hispanic descent that are voting. About a third of those are Cubans, a third are Puerto Ricans, and the other third are kind of an amalgamated mishmash of everything from Venezuelans to Colombians, Mexican Americans, Central Americans, and each has really we've designed a specific focus and communication strategy to effectuate their vote. All very unique, all very different, some extraordinarily different, different techniques and different tactics. So it really is kind of a misnomer to say, quote unquote, the Hispanic vote. We're really talking about a very diverse set, both linguistically in terms of tone, racially, ethnically, economic class, how far removed you are from the immigrant experience. Puerto Ricans, of course, are naturalized citizens from the get-go, but have moved en masse to the I-4 corridor. And so we use techniques to literally communicate with relatives, urging them to tell their friends and family that are living in Florida to show up and vote on their behalf. So some really sophisticated techniques, really exciting stuff. Again, for somebody like me who's been doing this for 3 decades, we're finally getting to the point where we're recognizing this tremendous nuance, these tremendous differences. And really, I think in a few short years, we probably won't be using the term Hispanic as much as we'll be referring to the specific audiences under that larger Latino umbrella.
Mike Madrid, great to talk to you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for having me. It's always a pleasure.
The Senate Judiciary Committee's confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney-Barrett wrapped up earlier today. The process is happening with unprecedented speed ahead of the election, following the death, of course, of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg last month. At the outset this week, Judge Barrett was keen to try and reassure particularly dubious Democratic senators that she was not planning to be an activist on the bench and would treat every case on its merits without prejudice.
Courts are not designed to solve every problem or right every wrong in our public life. The policy decisions and value judgments of government must be made by the political branches, elected by and accountable to the people.
Adding a little extra political spice into all of this week, Democratic Vice Presidential nominee Kamala Harris was among the senators to question Judge Barrett. It didn't all go smoothly, though.
Hello?
We hear you.
Chairman, this hearing has brought together more than 50 people to sit inside a room for hours. A closed door. Yes.
Just wait just 1 second. We don't see you.
Of course.
I think we can all relate to that right now. Despite some more technical problems, Senator Harris made her displeasure with the entire proceedings well known.
This hearing should have been postponed. The decision to hold this hearing now is reckless and places facilities workers, janitorial staff, and congressional aides and Capitol Police at risk.
Kamala Harris, by the way, has since revealed that she has been in contact with an aide who has contracted COVID-19 and will be isolating herself off the campaign trail for a couple of days. Other senators, though, appeared in person, including Republican Mike Lee of Utah, who contracted coronavirus at that White House super spreader event for Barrett just 3 weeks ago. Like Trump, he says he has now tested negative. He wore a mask until it was his time to speak. And when he did, he argued that, well, the Supreme Court isn't such a big deal anyway.
We can't overstate or overplay the role the Supreme Court of the United States might exert.
Well, Democrats will be hoping he is right, Chaz.
Yes, they will. Like, the hearing proceeded as they usually do these days. They don't shed much light. Republicans are trying to set up alley-oops for Barrett to seem like some kind of legal god.
You know, most of us have multiple notebooks and notes and books and things like that in front of us. Can you hold up what you've been referring to in answering our questions? Is there anything on it?
That letterhead that says United States Senate.
That's impressive.
Look, she's very, very warm and friendly. You don't need notes to say nothing. And Democrats were desperately trying to get Barrett to say anything about her judicial opinions, but she was pretty good at deadbatting it, as the nominees usually are. This was when Amy Klobuchar tried to catch her out with her not describing Roe versus Wade as a super precedent in one of her previous academic articles.
Okay, well, people use super precedent differently.
Okay.
The way that it's used in the scholarship and the way that I was using it in the article that you're reading from was to define cases that are so well settled that no political actors and no people seriously push for their overruling. And I'm answering a lot of questions about Roe, which I think indicates that Roe doesn't fall in that category. And scholars across the spectrum say that doesn't mean that Roe should be overruled. But descriptively, it does mean that it's not a case that everyone has accepted and doesn't call for its overruling.
Nice try, Democrats, but...
Yeah, it's the old kabuki play. Everybody knows that whether it's a Liberal justice or a Conservative justice, that's why they're there, and yet they just say, well, I couldn't possibly tell you the answer to that. I just wait till I see the case come before me. I'm not going to prejudge it. Yeah. Democrats do concede that they can't stop Amy Coney-Barrett's confirmation at this point, but they do still hope to turn it very much to their political advantage, presenting her as a threat to the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and to the health care of tens of millions of Americans as a result.
This administration, with the support of Senate Republicans, will be in front of the Supreme Court on November 10th to argue that the entire Affordable Care Act should be struck down. That's in 29 days that'll happen.
Yeah, look, I've really got to chip in at this point in time. I think it was a sensible strategy for the Democrats to hang the Obamacare lawsuit around the Republicans' necks. I suggested they do that myself. But if we're being honest here, there's really nothing to it. That Obamacare case is a joke. I'm not going to bore you with the legal details. If you want to be bored, you can see on the podcast. I'll go into detail there. But I will say this, that there will be at least 2, if not 3 Republican justices that would need to reverse a precedent they upheld this year for that case to prevail. Okay, number 1. Number 2, why is it even in the Supreme Court? Without going into the details, essentially the Fifth Circuit Appeals Court held up a part of the case that doesn't matter and knocked down a part of the case that does matter, as far as getting rid of it goes. And at that point in time, the lefties who were fighting the case said, why don't we get the Supreme Court in on this? Like, it wasn't going to go to the Supreme Court. It was going to go back down again to the district court to deal with. But they elevated to the Supreme Court because they thought they were going to win.
Yeah.
The guys who are defending Obamacare think they're going to win by saying to the Supreme Court. Okay, so even they think it's taken care of. And finally, Coney-Barrett did a mock trial on this exact case like 2 months ago, and she found against it. Now, that doesn't mean that she'll find against it in the real world, but
yeah, so look,
it's not going to win.
Some of the anxiety is very insincere. That is true. Yeah. But on the face of it, though, it is in the Supreme Court. This has been, 19 Republican state attorneys general have signed up to this thing as well. So if in some world they actually do find against Obamacare on this, it would have an impact. But that is a huge if, as you say. Look, it is almost certain that this process is going to play out in a pretty predictable way. The only question really now is what price Republicans are going to pay politically at the election, unless Democrats overreach at some point and face a backlash from women and Catholic voters. They really resisted that. You know, the Republicans all week, they basically kept saying, Democrats are making this all about the fact that she's a Catholic and they're anti-Catholic. And
they just weren't.
We have literally not mentioned Catholic once. Oh, yes, but you hate Catholics. It's like Joe Biden is running to be the second Catholic president of the United States. We're not against Catholics. Yeah. They tried, both sides tried. But funnily enough, when they wrapped up earlier today, the senior Democrat on the committee, Dianne Feinstein, had some rather surprising praise for the Republican committee chair, Lindsey Graham, who is in the fight for his political life right now in a close Senate race in South Carolina. And Lindsey had some rather kind words in return. Take a look.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you. This has been one of the best set of hearings that I've participated in. And I want to thank you for your fairness and the opportunity of going back and forth. So thank you so much for your leadership.
Well, one, that means a lot to me, and I know we have very different views about the judge and whether we should be doing this or not. But having said all that, to my Democratic colleagues, you have challenged the judge, you've challenged us, and I accept those challenges as being sincere and not personal. I don't think anybody crossed the line with the judge in terms of trying to demean her as a person.
And then, despite everything, despite the rancour of the past 4 years over Merrick Garland, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and now Amy Coney-Barrett, the two of them had a hug. It was quite a moment.
How about that? I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah.
All I'd say about this is that you talk about the political price Republicans are going to pay. I don't think it's going to be much, because you look at the polls, Amy Coney-Barrett's pretty popular. She went from 37% favouring her confirmation before the election in September to 46% a week ago. Now it's 48%. So I think she's won the propaganda battle.
We will see.
But I just want to talk quickly about something that's been going on in the background this whole week, because the Democrats' attempts to grapple with whether they want to pack the Supreme Court or not has actually been right at the forefront of this whole thing. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been steadfastly refusing to answer questions about this for weeks. We've talked about that. I think Joe Biden came up with the worst answer yet this week.
They'll know my opinion of court packing when the election is over. Now look, I know it's a great question for y'all, and I don't blame you for asking it. But you know, the moment I answer that question, the headline in every one of your papers will be about that. Other than focusing on what's happening now.
Okay, that was not great, and I've gone on about court packing endlessly. I'm not a fan of it. I think it's terrible. I think it should be real court reform, and that isn't whatever that is. That's not reform. But I really want to just set the record straight about some of the extraordinary self-righteousness that's been on display about this issue over the last couple of weeks. Okay, because history did not begin last week. Back in 2013, when you could still filibuster judicial appointments, Mitch McConnell blocked every attempt to fill the 3 vacant seats on the second most important court behind the Supreme Court, the DC Court of Appeals. And Tom Cotton actually introduced a bill to reduce the number of seats on that court by 3. So they were messing with court numbers as well, okay? That's how dodgy they were back then. And in 2016, both Georgia and Arizona saw Republicans adding 2 seats to their state Supreme Courts to create new conservative majorities, packing the court. And I didn't see any Republicans decrying the politicization of the courts back then, okay? There is a bipartisan context to this as well. Some have pointed to this graph showing that W. Bush had a much higher percentage of nominees blocked than Obama did. But remember, W. Bush spent more of his administration with an opposing Senate. Obama only had 2 years of that, but if you look at the confirmation rate under divided government, that has been decreasing for decades. And Obama had way fewer judges confirmed under an opposing party Senate than anyone before him. W. Bush had 68 confirmations in his last 2 years. Obama only had 22, okay? So no one is innocent here. But just one more thought. Maybe Joe Biden is being cagey about court packing, not because he's trying to sneak it through, but because he doesn't want to disappoint the left. He hinted at that just the other day.
I've already spoken on. I'm not a fan of court packing, but I don't want to get off on that whole issue. I want to keep focused.
And on he went with the usual stuff. But you can see he's just raring to say, I don't want court packing.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Could well be right. Well, for more, we're joined by Ilya Shapiro, one of America's leading constitutional law experts. He's based at the Cato Institute and author of the new book on nominations to the Supreme Court. It's called Supreme Disorder. Ilya, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Good to be with you.
Everything that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years over Supreme Court nominations, what did you make of that moment at the very, very end today between Lindsey Graham and Dianne Feinstein? That took me by surprise.
I think that was one of the few genuine moments of the whole kabuki theater that we've seen. Not that they necessarily, are best friends, but they try to make the best of a very difficult political situation. And in fact, soon after that, left-wing Democratic activists called for Feinstein's removal from the being ranking member on that committee because she's so friendly to the opposition.
Did you see that as a return to old school Senate manners and protocols, or is it, as Dianne Feinstein suggested, possibly a hint that in the future, maybe in a post-Trump future, the Senate might get back to working a little bit more in the national interest? Is that too much to hope for?
I don't know. I don't want to seem naive, but we've seen a ratcheting up of tensions over judicial nominations going back decades. So it would really take a significant disruption to change something like that.
Ilya, do you think there's any point to judicial confirmation hearings in 2020?
I don't think so. I think at this point, the cost to our public discourse, getting in the muck, making the Supreme Court seem as political as the senators from both sides is greater than any benefit we get from, learning about the law. We certainly don't learn about the nominee. Everyone's playing from this playbook where the nominee talks a lot, doesn't say anything. The senators are either lobbing softballs or going for gotcha moments. And at the end of the day, I think the public hearings have served their purpose, and we can learn even more from just reading the writings of the nominee on the internet than this, as I said, this kabuki theater going through the motions that we've seen the last few days.
Ilya, I just got done explaining why I think the Obamacare lawsuit is unlikely to succeed with or without Amy Coney-Barrett. Do you agree that the concerns with regards to Obamacare are unlikely to be justified?
Absolutely. And I say this as someone who was one of the leading lawyers fighting Obamacare back in 2010 to 2012 when that decision came down from the Supreme Court. This is a different case now for various technical legal reasons that I don't think we need to get into now. But I don't think there's one vote to overturn all of that health care law, let alone 4, such that Justice Barrett would be the deciding vote.
The other big concern, of course, raised by Democrats, Ilya, is the future of the right to choose to have a termination under the Roe versus Wade case. Is it any more realistic that we could see cases that supersede that, if not overturn that?
Well, look, just like the Obamacare debate was a political argument addressing the voters more than Judge Barrett or anyone else in this confirmation process, the evergreen debate over abortion over Roe v. Wade, I think we're several votes away from having that change the fundamental right, as she herself, Judge Barrett herself, acknowledged in several speeches along the way. Now, what it means is that the margins, if some state passes a regulation or restriction, which even this past year at the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts joined the progressives in overturning, I think in the future, that might mean that those kinds of regulations would be upheld. But the underlying right, I don't think, is in danger with this one additional justice.
So, Ilya, what do you think the Democrats should be worried about? What do you think the issues are that would be most likely to undergo significant revision under a 6-3 conservative court?
Well, certainly the Second Amendment, which is the right to keep and bear arms, I think that would change. This past term, there was a case that ended up being mooted out, and then the court declined to review about 10 petitions that were very well teed up. And the court hasn't addressed the scope of that right in a dozen years. I know it works differently in Australia than it does here, but obviously a sensitive issue. And John Roberts implementing his what we could call strategery, or extra legal considerations, and not wanting to politicize the court as he sees it, gave an indication to his colleagues that he was not necessarily a reliable vote. Well, if he's the superfluous man, if he's the sixth vote rather than the fifth, then I think we could see the Supreme Court, and more likely than not will see, starting to flesh out that right and giving direction to the lower courts that have been all over the place about it.
So faced with the possibility that that we could see changes in that area and others, Democrats are talking about Supreme Court reforms, the suggestion of maybe increasing the number of justices or imposing term limits on justices. Based on your writing and your experience, are there reforms that could have a positive advantage, that could lead to greater public trust in the Supreme Court, or is the court itself not the problem?
Well, it's kind of a bizarre argument to say that we need to pack the court, that is, add more justices for political reasons, to depoliticize the court or make it seem more legitimate. It's kind of a two wrongs making a right sort of argument. Term limits, I'm mildly favorable to. It would at least eliminate the morbid health watches of octogenarian justices and the politically timed retirements with arbitrary vacancies at politically awkward times, shall we say. That it would fix. But it wouldn't change the ideological balance of the court or the court's power. It's ruling on the biggest political controversies in the land. At the end of the day, all of these reform proposals are rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And the Titanic is not the confirmation process, it's the ship of state. It's the fact that so much power has been centralized in Washington, making the Supreme Court so powerful and each seat so important. So the only way to detoxify this process, or to turn down the heat on judicial battles, is to return power to the states and the people, and to rearrange the way that power is within Washington. So Congress is actually forced to debate and make decisions on political issues, rather than punting it to the executive branch, the administrative agencies, which then are sued, and this all goes to the Supreme Court. Now, this is not a magic bullet. This is not a panacea, and this is not an overnight solution. I'm sorry, I don't have anything easy like that. It took us decades to get to where we are. It would take decades to unwind it.
What would you say, Ilya, to the argument that, let's forget the rebalancing the court argument the Democrats use, but what about the argument saying you need to pack the court to force Republicans to come to the table to consider real reform? Because at the moment, they'd be very happy with the situation with the court for the next few decades, and they'd be unlikely to support any reform whatsoever with the court as it is. So that's the way to basically blow up the court, to force Republicans to join you in reforming it.
I think it's too clever by half. This is one of the few things I'm probably in agreement with Bernie Sanders on, the big socialist who was running in the Democratic presidential primary, who said that, well, if we pack the court, the next time Republicans are in power, they'll pack it. And I'm not going to do the Brooklyn accent, but in 50 years, we're going to have 87 justices. It's crazy. And I think that's right. I mean, if you really want to de-escalate, then there's perhaps other things to do, like Congress actually debating laws and making compromises. There's the COVID pandemic, there's the relief bill that's been stalled, been filibustered by the Democrats in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi wants a couple of more $1 trillion spent than anyone on the Republican side. I mean, if you try negotiating in good faith, that might do something. It might take Donald Trump leaving the White House.
On that question, Ilya, clearly President Trump saw this as an opportunity to remind some conservatives that weren't necessarily 100% for him, but were certainly for the list of Supreme Court justices he published in both 2016 and earlier this year. Could this, do you think, politically backfire for the president, that those same conservatives could say, well, we got our three, we're done with this guy now?
It could, but a bird in the hand is always more than one in the bush, right? Or two in the bush, however that expression goes. I don't know how it translates in Australia. It's probably something with koalas and dingoes or something. But, the judge's issue is one of the few. I think it's easily the most successful part of the Trump administration. It held the Republican coalition together in 2016. He can run on that. He didn't need to expand his list. People already, because of his record, could trust him on that. I don't know if it's going to be enough, but it's certainly a big selling point. And getting the big win of the confirmation just a few days ahead of the election, which is what the timing looks like the eventual Senate vote will be, I'm sure he'd rather have that than something less certain.
Ilya Shapiro, we really appreciate your perspective on this. Thank you very much for giving us the time.
My pleasure. Take care.
And that is all for another Fireside Chat. We will be back for Planet America next Wednesday night, 9:30 p.m. on ABC TV.
But do not forget the piping hot, brand new, fresh pep podcast right there.
Bye-bye.